Vivian Marsh's car died on a mountain road with no cell signal, just hours before a meeting that could decide the fate of her entire company. When a battered pickup truck pulled over, she reluctantly asked its driver, a quiet single father named Owen Reyes, for a ride, certain he belonged to a world far beneath her own. She urged him to hurry, glancing at her watch every few minutes, until he calmly read aloud the address of his own destination. Vivian went still. It was the exact address written on the sealed letter in her bag, the same estate, the same hour, the same impossible summons. Neither of them yet understood that a dead engineer's final wish had quietly bound their fates together, or that the future of thousands of families now rested on whether a CEO and a mechanic could learn to trust one another before nightfall. Vivian had left the city alone that morning, driving her own car instead of bringing her assistant or driver, because the letter she carried demanded absolute discretion. It had arrived on heavy paper, and signed except for a notary seal, instructing her to appear at a manor on Cedar Ridge Road in the small mountain town of Pine Hollow before 6 that evening. She had read it 4 times before deciding to go, sensing that whatever waited there might be the only thing standing between Marsh Dynamics and total collapse. If she missed the appointment, the letter warned, negotiating rights to a piece of technology she barely understood would pass to someone else entirely, and she suspected that someone was Desmond Voss, the man who already held her company's debt in his hands. The drive went smoothly through the valley, past orchards turning gold and rivers swollen with autumn rain, until the road narrowed and climbed into thinner air where her phone lost signal completely. Past a bend lined with birch trees, the dashboard flickered, the engine sputtered, and her sedan rolled to a silent stop on the gravel shoulder just as rain began to fall. She tried the ignition 3 times, met each time with nothing but a dull click, and stepped out into the cold to search under the hood for anything obviously wrong. Nothing was. The wiring looked intact, the terminals were clean, yet the car refused every attempt to bring it back to life, as if something inside had simply decided to quit at the worst possible moment. For the first time in years, Vivian felt the particular helplessness of a person with money and nowhere to spend it. That was when headlights swung around the bend. An old pickup pulled up behind her, its bed loaded with a battered toolbox and coiled rope. The man who climbed out wore a grease-stained canvas jacket and crossed the road without hurrying, glancing once at the sky as if gauging the daylight left. He introduced himself simply as Owen, said he'd take a look if she wanted, and knelt by the open hood without waiting for her answer. Within a minute he'd traced something in the control unit that made him frown. The failure, he murmured, didn't look like ordinary wear. More like a component had been deliberately tampered with. Vivian nearly laughed, certain a small-town mechanic couldn't understand electronics in a car worth more than his truck, his tools, and probably his house combined. But when he explained, plainly and precisely, which subsystem had failed and why it couldn't be fixed roadside, she realized with quiet irritation that he was almost certainly right. Time was slipping away, the rain thickening, and her carefully guarded appointment now depended on a stranger with grease under his nails and an accent that belonged to these mountains rather than any boardroom she'd known. Swallowing her pride, she asked if he could drive her somewhere. Owen checked his watch, admitted he was already running late for an appointment of his own, and agreed anyway. Vivian climbed into the passenger seat, unaware the man beside her held more power over her company's future than anyone on her board. The cab smelled of oil and pine. A child's rain jacket lay folded on the back seat, a scuffed toolbox wedged behind the footwell, a chipped mug in the cup holder read "World's Okayest Dad" in faded letters. She understood without asking that he was raising a child alone, and something in her softened that she didn't entirely welcome. She kept checking her watch, unable to stop, and eventually offered him a sum that made his eyebrows lift if he'd just drive faster on the wet curves. Owen declined, calmly, saying the road was slick and no meeting was worth a crash. His flat certainty irritated her more than an argument would have. She told him, sharper than intended, that he couldn't possibly understand what it meant to carry responsibility for thousands of people who depended on decisions made in rooms he'd never enter. He answered quietly that responsibility wasn't measured by how many names a person could recite, and the remark landed with a weight she chose not to examine. As the truck climbed higher, Owen spoke about battery architecture and thermal safety with a fluency no ordinary mechanic should have, correcting a common misconception about charging cycles as casually as commenting on weather. She asked, half joking, where a repairman picked up knowledge like that. He only said he'd worked in a different field once, before his life changed direction, and offered nothing more. When the truck crested a ridge and her phone caught a flickering signal, a message arrived from Nolan Price, her CFO, warning that Desmond Voss had already arrived at the estate and was growing impatient. Nolan urged her, in the clipped tone he used during a crisis, to sign whatever terms were placed in front of her rather than risk losing Voss's cooperation. Owen's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel at the name Voss. He said nothing, but Vivian caught it and filed it away. She asked him directly where he was headed. Instead of answering, Owen reached into his jacket and produced a sealed envelope bearing the same embossed crest she'd seen on her own letter that morning, the crest of the Whitfield family. Vivian read the address aloud, watching his face as she recited the number on Cedar Ridge Road, and Owen eased off the accelerator as if the coincidence demanded caution. He asked her to repeat it, then pulled onto the shoulder and opened his own envelope, holding it out so she could see the matching time, date, and seal. Something cold settled in Vivian's chest. The letter that summoned her had promised absolute secrecy, a private negotiation between her and one other party. She immediately suspected Owen might be working for Voss, planted along her route to gather information or delay her arrival. Sensing her withdrawal, Owen simply handed the envelope over and let her examine it as thoroughly as she wished. The notary's seal matched. The attorney's signature matched. Even the strange verification code at the bottom matched exactly what she'd memorized. The only difference was in their titles. Hers named her commercial representative of the estate, his named him technical guardian, a designation she'd never once encountered. Owen admitted he didn't recognize the term either, though he confirmed that Edmund Whitfield, the estate's late owner, had once been his employer, saying little else. The name struck a chord. Vivian remembered a joint venture her own father had pursued with Whitfield Innovations years earlier, one that collapsed amid rumors of a catastrophic engineering failure. She recalled, with growing unease, that the engineer blamed for that failure had carried the surname Reyes, and she turned to study the quiet man beside her with new, uncomfortable clarity. Owen met her gaze without flinching, neither confirming nor denying what she was piecing together. Vivian's mind raced toward the worst possibility, that this man had nursed a grievance for 6 years and orchestrated this entire encounter for quiet revenge. Owen seemed to read the accusation forming behind her eyes and told her plainly he hadn't come for her, wanted nothing from Marsh Dynamics, only an answer to why Edmund Whitfield had summoned him back after 6 years of silence. Something in his steadiness made her believe him enough to let the accusation die unspoken. Ahead, through thinning rain, the iron gates of the Whitfield estate came into view, flanked by a row of gleaming vehicles belonging to Voss's entourage. Owen parked the old pickup awkwardly among the black sedans, looking like a farm animal wandering into a horse show. A security guard approached, glancing at the mud-splattered truck and assuming its driver had come to deliver a package. Vivian stepped down first, and the guard straightened at once, addressing her by title and ushering her toward the entrance with practiced deference. Desmond Voss emerged onto the portico, tall and silver-haired, his smile arriving before his words, remarking loudly enough for the staff to hear that he was surprised Vivian had chosen such unusual transportation. He turned to Owen next, pressing a folded bill toward him and instructing him, with casual condescension, to park the truck around back with the staff vehicles. Owen didn't take the money. He said simply that he'd been invited as well. A claim that widened Voss's smile into something closer to amusement than belief. Voss suggested to Vivian, in a tone of friendly concern, that the man was likely exploiting her generosity by inventing some connection to the estate. Vivian, still uncertain herself what Owen's letter meant, didn't immediately defend him, and her silence sat uneasily in her stomach even as it happened. Nolan Price arrived at Voss's elbow, glancing at Owen's face for a long beat before murmuring something that made Voss's expression flicker once before smoothing back into practiced calm. Voss recovered and instructed security to escort Owen off the property, citing the sensitivity of the discussions ahead. 2 guards began moving toward the truck. Owen produced his envelope a second time, but Voss waved it away, remarking that any document could be forged by someone determined to gain entry. At that exact moment the estate's doors opened again, and a silver-haired woman in a tailored gray suit stepped onto the portico, her bearing carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. She crossed the gravel drive directly to Owen, introduced herself as Adele Foster, attorney for the Whitfield estate, and announced that the meeting could not proceed without him present. She turned to Voss and, with the same unhurried authority, informed him the seat at the head of the table had been reserved for Owen Reyes, and he'd need to find another place to sit. The guards froze, uncertain which instruction to follow. The staff who'd laughed at his truck moments earlier fell into watchful silence. Vivian felt the ground shift beneath her assumptions, realizing the man she'd almost dismissed as an inconvenient hitchhiker was, in fact, the very reason this gathering existed. Voss's composure cracked for a heartbeat before he masked it again, and Nolan stepped back as if putting distance between himself and whatever was about to be revealed. Adele gestured them inside before the light failed, and the group moved together into the entrance hall, footsteps echoing on marble that had witnessed far more secrets than any of them yet understood. Vivian caught Owen's eye as they crossed the threshold, wondering for the first time whether the man beside her held more power over the coming hours than she did. Inside the library, dark shelves rose to a vaulted ceiling, and a long table held folders, a projector, and one sealed envelope larger than the rest. Adele opened a leather folio and explained that Edmund Whitfield had recorded a final message before his death, meant to be played only when both designated parties were present. The lights dimmed, and Whitfield's voice filled the room, steady despite the illness that had clearly weakened him by the time of recording. He confessed, without preamble, that Nexus Core, a breakthrough system capable of transforming energy management across the electric vehicle industry, had been built on software architecture originally designed by Owen Reyes. The admission landed like a stone into still water. Vivian glanced sideways to see Owen's jaw tighten, his eyes fixed on the screen. Whitfield continued, heavier now, admitting he'd remained silent 6 years earlier when Owen was wrongly blamed for a catastrophic failure, afraid that defending him would cost the company Voss's crucial investment. Owen didn't react with triumph. His expression carried only quiet, exhausted grief for the year's truth had failed to return to him. The recording laid out the will's terms in detail. Owen would become technical guardian over Nexus Core, holding sole authority over its safety and engineering integrity. Vivian would be named commercial guardian, entrusted with bringing the technology to market, given her leadership at Marsh Dynamics. Neither guardian could license, sell, or activate the technology without the other's written agreement, a safeguard Whitfield had built specifically to prevent either from exploiting it alone. If they failed to agree by noon the next day, ownership would transfer automatically into a non-profit research trust, locking the technology away from commercial use for a decade. Voss, never one to waste an opening, immediately offered to buy Owen's guardianship rights outright, naming a figure of $50 million as if the number alone might settle things. Owen refused without hesitation, flat and certain, and the refusal seemed to unsettle Voss more than any counteroffer could have. Vivian felt panic rising beneath her composure. Her company couldn't survive a decade locked out of the very technology that might save it, and found herself resenting Owen for a principle she wasn't sure she understood. She pressed him afterward, asking quietly whether he intended to use his new authority as revenge against a company that had never personally wronged him, only inherited a debt of silence. Owen told her he'd sign nothing until Nexus Core's safety was proven beyond doubt, and until the truth of 6 years ago was finally allowed into the light rather than buried under another negotiated silence. Voss warned, with practiced gravity, that dragging old history into public view could permanently damage Marsh Dynamics' reputation at the worst possible moment. Vivian stood caught between protecting the company that carried her family's name and finally correcting an injustice that had quietly poisoned everything built upon it. Adele stepped forward and placed a small brass key on the table between them, explaining that Whitfield had left behind a hidden laboratory beneath the mansion. Only the two guardians together held the authority to enter, and whatever waited inside would likely decide more than either of them yet realized. A narrow staircase behind a bookshelf led Owen and Vivian down into a laboratory sealed away for years, its air cool and faintly metallic, dark server banks lining one wall. Voss and Nolan waited upstairs under Adele's supervision. At the center of the room sat a working prototype of Nexus Core, its casing scratched from years of testing, wired to an offline server bank requiring a specific startup sequence. Owen typed it from memory, fingers moving with the ease of someone recalling a language once spoken fluently, and Vivian watched, genuinely astonished, as screens flickered to life. For the first time since the roadside breakdown, she saw with total clarity that the man beside her was not merely competent, but exceptional, someone whose mechanic's jacket had entirely concealed his true expertise. As diagnostics loaded, Owen noticed an inconsistency buried in the core algorithm. A section clearly modified after his departure from Whitfield Innovations. The altered code prioritized raw performance over thermal safety margins, shaving fractions of a second off charging times at the cost of a failure rate that would be statistically small but, across thousands of vehicles, devastatingly real. Vivian recognized it immediately. This was precisely the streamlined version boss had been pressuring her to approve without the usual months of safety certification. They had only until sunrise to complete a full verification before the board meeting that would determine whether Marsh Dynamics survived its mounting debts. Vivian brought her command of production timelines and market data. Owen brought the technical fluency to trace every altered parameter to its origin. They argued more than once, Vivian pushing for speed, Owen refusing to cut any corner that might endanger a driver, yet each began to recognize real value in what the other offered. In a quieter moment, Vivian admitted the company had barely 6 weeks of operating capital left, a confession she hadn't made even to most of her own board. Owen, in turn, spoke briefly of losing his home, career, and reputation after the accusation 6 years earlier, and said only that he refused to let another family pay the price for decisions made by people who'd never feel the consequences themselves. Deep in an archived log file, buried among thousands of routine entries, Owen finally found what he'd spent 6 years unable to prove, an electronic signature belonging to Nolan Price, attached to the exact code modification that had once destroyed his career. He turned the screen toward Vivian and walked her through the timestamp, showing how Nolan's credentials had approved the fatal alteration before quietly rerouting blame onto an account registered under Owen's name. The evidence was compelling, though a portion of surrounding data remained encrypted, persuasive, but not yet strong enough to stand alone legally. Vivian was reluctant to accept it. Nolan had worked beside her family for 12 years, present at every crisis and celebration. Owen reminded her gently that loyalty could never be measured by title or tenure, only by what a person did when no one was watching. Rather than confronting Nolan immediately, Vivian summoned him to the laboratory under the pretense of reviewing routine figures. Nolan denied everything the moment suspicion entered her voice, insisting Owen had fabricated the records to extort money. Voss arrived moments later, drawn by some instinct for trouble, and declared that Owen had every reason to want revenge against the man who'd once employed him, framing the accusation as motive rather than truth. Together the two men tried to drive a wedge between Vivian and Owen, each offering her a different version of safety if only she'd abandon the guardian standing beside her. Voss proposed privately that if Vivian removed Owen from the negotiation entirely, Voss Capital Group would extend the company's crushing debt by another full year, a lifeline dressed as generosity. Nolan, working a separate angle, quietly handed her a document that would place full personal liability for any future failure of Nexus Core onto Owen alone, absolving both the company and its financial officer. Vivian read it slowly, and something in her hardened as she recognized the pattern repeating exactly as it had 6 years earlier, powerful men preparing to sacrifice an innocent man to protect their own interests. She set the pen down without signing, and for the first time since stepping off the mountain road, she stood openly on Owen's side of the room. When they returned to the laboratory shortly after to secure the evidence, they found every server dark and the drive containing Nolan's incriminating records gone without a trace. The mansion's power had failed only in one isolated section, a detail Owen found impossible to explain as coincidence. He traced the outage to a deliberate cut near the laboratory's own circuit, the kind of precise interruption that required knowledge of the building rather than luck. Voss seized on the disruption at once, arguing loudly that the failure proved Owen lacked the competence to be trusted with something as valuable as Nexus Core. Adele responded by ordering the estate's gates sealed and every guest to remain inside until the circumstances were understood. Vivian remembered, with a chill, that her own sedan had failed on the mountain road in almost exactly the same manner, systems dying with no visible mechanical cause. The two failures carried an identical signature: clean, invisible sabotage. Owen examined a nearby control panel and discovered a small jamming device tucked behind an access panel. The hallway cameras nearest the laboratory had gone dark for exactly 7 minutes, a window narrow enough to seem incidental but precise enough to feel intentional. Nolan claimed he'd been on a private call during that window, but produced no call log, no witness, nothing that satisfied the room. Rather than confronting him again directly, Owen quietly examined the leather case Nolan had carried since he arrived. Vivian, meanwhile, used her authority as chief executive to access Nolan's corporate financial accounts remotely, uncovering a long trail of payments routed through a shell company tied directly to Voss Capital Group. When Nolan tried to leave under the pretense of an urgent family matter, Adele stopped him at the door, citing an asset preservation clause in Whitfield's estate. It was Owen who ultimately located the missing drive, not in Nolan's case at all, but hidden in a battery compartment in Voss's own vehicle parked outside. Voss insisted immediately that someone had planted it to frame him, his composure slipping for the first time all evening. Owen explained, calmly and without triumph, that whoever took the drive couldn't have known it carried a small backup transmitter. A safeguard he'd built into sensitive devices years before he ever imagined needing it again. The signal led directly to the vehicle now sitting in Voss's private parking space. Vivian finally understood the full shape of what had happened to her that afternoon. Her own car had been deliberately disabled to make her miss the meeting, clearing the way for Voss to claim Nexus Core without resistance. Once the drive's contents were restored, one final audio file remained buried among the corrupted data, a conversation Vivian never expected to hear, one that included her own father's voice. The recording captured a private meeting from 6 years earlier between Edmund Whitfield, Desmond Voss, Nolan Price, and Vivian's father, discussing the very engineering failure that had ended Owen's career. Her father's voice, calm and businesslike, made clear he'd known even then that Owen bore no responsibility for what happened, yet he'd agreed to let the blame stand rather than jeopardize a critical investment partnership. Owen listened with visible stillness, his hands folded on the table, betraying nothing beyond the faint whitening of his knuckles as the truth arrived 6 years too late to matter the way he'd once needed it to. Vivian felt something inside her collapse quietly as she realized that part of her own career, her own rise, had been built unknowingly on an injustice done to the very man sitting beside her. She apologized immediately, the words spilling out before she could measure them. Owen told her gently that an apology couldn't undo 6 years of a life rebuilt from nothing. Voss, sensing an opening in her visible guilt, moved quickly to exploit it, warning that if the recording became public, both her family's reputation and Marsh Dynamics' fragile stock price would collapse within days. He offered an alternative, a quiet path where the recording would simply disappear, the contract would be signed immediately, and the company would be saved before sunrise. In exchange, Owen would receive a substantial payment and a private, unpublicized acknowledgement of the wrong done to him, tidy and invisible, exactly the kind of arrangement that had protected these men for years. Owen refused outright, telling Vivian plainly he wouldn't let the truth become another quiet transaction conducted for the comfort of powerful people. Vivian asked directly whether he was willing to let thousands of ordinary employees lose their livelihoods simply to reclaim his own name. Owen answered that it was Voss forcing her into that impossible choice, not him, and that framing the decision as his fault was exactly the kind of manipulation that had cost him everything once before. The exchange left them both raw, and for a while they retreated to separate corners of the mansion, the earlier warmth between them cooling under the strain of the evening's revelations. Vivian climbed to an upper floor alone and stared down a printed list of manufacturing plants scheduled for closure if the company's credit line collapsed, each representing hundreds of families she'd never met but now felt responsible for. Downstairs, Owen stepped outside briefly to call his daughter Wren, keeping his voice light so she wouldn't sense how uncertain the coming hours truly were. Vivian, passing nearby, overheard him promise Wren he'd be home soon, a promise made without real certainty. Watching him through the doorway, she understood with sudden clarity that this was a man who'd lost almost everything more than once, yet still refused every offer to protect himself by harming someone else. She returned to the laboratory and proposed a third path neither Voss nor Nolan had considered, one that didn't require choosing between truth and survival. They would release the truth publicly, she said, and simultaneously use Nexus Core itself to attract entirely new investment, breaking the company's dependence on Voss's financing for good. To make it real, she'd have to convince her own board by morning. A board where a majority of votes belonged to allies quietly loyal to Voss's interests. Vivian convened an emergency virtual board meeting shortly after sunrise, her exhaustion masked behind the composed voice she'd spent years perfecting. Voss, joining from another room of the estate, spoke first and confidently declared that Vivian had failed to secure the guardianship rights necessary to save the company. Nolan, still trying to salvage his position, proposed the board immediately vote to remove Vivian, framing her judgment as compromised by an outsider with no real standing. Several board members openly questioned why the fate of a multi-billion-dollar company should depend on a man who, as far as they understood, repaired vehicles for a living in a small mountain town. Voss couldn't resist adding, with a thin smile audible even through the call, that it seemed absurd to trust the future of Nexus Core to the driver of an aging pickup truck. Owen said nothing in response to the insult, standing quietly beside Vivian, his composure unshaken by opinions that once cost him everything but no longer held the same power over him. Instead, he presented the safety data methodically, walking the board through exactly how the altered version of Nexus Core would fail under real-world conditions if Voss's accelerated production timeline were approved without proper testing. One skeptical board member pressed him on his credentials, questioning whether someone with no current corporate title could be trusted to evaluate something this consequential. Adele intervened, presenting the original patents, employment records, and the explicit terms of Whitfield's will, establishing beyond doubt that Owen was not merely qualified but legally and technically central to the entire technology. Vivian followed immediately with the financial evidence she and Owen had recovered overnight, laying out in precise detail how Nolan had manipulated internal data and deliberately deepened the company's dependence on Voss's capital. Nolan was suspended on the spot, and the board agreed unanimously to notify financial regulators of the irregularities uncovered in his accounts. Voss, sensing his leverage evaporating, threatened to withdraw his firm's financing immediately, hoping the shock alone would force the board back into line. Vivian answered by unveiling the restructuring plan she and Owen had spent the night preparing, a framework built to survive without depending on Voss at all. Nexus Core would be licensed to Marsh Dynamics under the strict safety standards Owen himself had established. A portion of future profits would go toward protecting jobs and restoring intellectual property rights, and every line of testing data would undergo independent audit before release. New investors, already quietly approached through Adele's network, stood ready to commit fresh capital the moment Voss's controlling influence was removed from the table. The plan received immediate support from Adele and from a major pension fund with significant holdings in the company, tipping the balance of the room decisively. The board reversed its earlier hesitation and firmly rejected the motion to remove Vivian, choosing instead to back the very plan Voss had dismissed minutes before. In a matter of minutes, Desmond Voss lost control over a deal he'd spent years quietly engineering. Standing before the full board, Vivian declared plainly that the person who had truly saved Marsh Dynamics was not a billionaire investor, but the very man they had all mocked for arriving in a truck stained with engine grease. In the days that followed, the full record of what happened 6 years earlier was made public, correcting a story that had stood uncontested for far too long. Owen was formally cleared of every allegation once made against him, and his role as the original architect behind Nexus Core's foundational design was officially and permanently acknowledged. Nolan faced a formal investigation into financial fraud and the deliberate sabotage of company data, his once trusted position dissolving under evidence that could no longer be hidden. Voss lost his seat among the company's primary creditors and found himself facing a series of civil lawsuits from shareholders who felt deliberately misled about the true state of the company's finances. None of it required violence or dramatic confrontation, only the quiet, grinding machinery of law and consequence finally catching up with people who had assumed themselves untouchable. Vivian called a public press conference shortly afterward, standing before cameras to openly acknowledge her own family's role in helping conceal an injustice they'd known about for years. The admission cost her a measure of her reputation in the short term, yet within weeks it had earned her something far more durable, the renewed trust of her employees and the public alike. Owen declined every offer of an executive title or a corner office, choosing instead to lead an independent safety council overseeing Nexus Core's continued development, a role flexible enough to leave him time for Ren every evening. He kept his small mobile repair business running exactly as before, unwilling to abandon the modest life he'd rebuilt piece by piece after losing everything the first time. Vivian drove out to his garage herself to deliver the finalized partnership agreement, arriving this time without an assistant, without a driver, and without the polished armor she usually wore into meetings. She thanked him quietly, without ceremony, for putting her on a road she'd never imagined she needed to travel until the moment her car broke down beside his. Owen told her, in the same unhurried voice he'd used since the day they met, that she alone had decided not to return to the version of the company that had once been comfortable with silence. The late afternoon light slanted low across the gravel lot as they stood together beside his truck, the noise of the highway distant behind them. Before she left, Vivian asked, almost hesitantly, whether Owen might be willing to give her one more ride sometime. An offer that carried far more meaning than the simple words suggested. Several months passed, and Marsh Dynamics steadied itself enough that not a single manufacturing plant on the original closure list was forced to shut its doors. Nexus Core cleared every independent safety review with results stronger than even Owen had privately expected, vindicating the very standards he'd once nearly lost his career defending. He remained publicly recognized for his contribution, yet chose to keep the same simple rhythm of life he'd built for himself and Ren in the years since his disgrace. Vivian grew steadily closer to Owen and his daughter during those months, the friendship deepening slowly and without pressure, built on patience rather than urgency. One afternoon she pulled into his garage in a car running perfectly, its engine humming without complaint, and told him honestly that nothing about it was broken today. She simply didn't want to make the drive alone, she admitted, and asked instead where he happened to be headed that afternoon. Owen asked in return where she wanted to go, and Vivian read him an address she now knew by heart, the same address written on 2 sealed envelopes that had once brought them together as strangers. The old Whitfield mansion had since been transformed into a research and training center for young engineers, carrying Owen's name above its entrance in simple, unadorned lettering. Owen smiled faintly at the address this time, no longer surprised that their paths were leading to the same destination, only quietly grateful for the reason behind it. He walked around to open the passenger door for her. The same door he'd opened once before on a rainy afternoon that neither of them could have predicted would change everything. They pulled out of the garage together as the light softened over the hills, no longer a chief executive and a stranger with a truck, but two people who had chosen, deliberately and together, to build something more honest than either had known before. The first time Vivian Marsh climbed into that old truck, she had no other choice left. The second time, she climbed in because she finally knew exactly who she wanted beside her for the ride ahead.